They never learn, do they? They keep trying to refute the Jobava London system. And someday they may succeed, but I don't think they've succeeded yet. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and today we're looking at another attempt by a very strong player to try and refute the Jobava London system. We've looked at Sam Shanklin's attempt to refute the Jobava London in an earlier video. Now we're going to look at Gawain Jones, a near 2,700 FIDE rated Grandmaster from Great Britain. And he has a program on Chessable on the King's Indian. Really great. Incredibly expensive. You got to take out a second mortgage to pay for it, but it is really, really great. And in that, he has a defensive system against everything except e4. And that includes the Jobava London system. So let's take a look at his recommendation against the Jobava London, maybe contrast it with Simon Williams' recommendation in his program, and see what we can come up with. Let's take a look. d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4. This is the Jobava London system on the board. The knight at c3, the bishop at f4. g6, e3, bishop to g7. Now, white plays h4. White wants to play h5 and open up the h-file for the rook. And Gawain Jones recommends the move h5 to slow that down, to keep white from opening the h-file. Knight f3, castles, bishop e2, and now c5 is recommended for black. dc5, queen to a5, castles, and queen to c5. And this is, we're still in both Simon Williams' program and in Gawain Jones, so they haven't yet diverged. And in this position, white actually scores really, really well, over 70% in my database. I mean, in terms of computer ideas, it's fine for black, but it's a really high score for white. That means white has a comfortable position, and that's good to know. White plays knight to b5, one of the signature moves of the Jobava London system, aiming for that c7 square with the knight. a6 hits the knight. Knight goes to c7, attacking the rook at a8. The rook moves to a7. Now, this position has been played at a very high level. Arkady Naiditch played this against Magnus Carlsen. That's a 2,700 versus a 2,800 plus. Obviously, Carlsen's #1 in the world. And in this position, Naiditch played knight to b5. It looks like he's just giving the knight up, but he's actually unleashing the bishop at f4 on black's knight on b8. So Carlsen took the knight, bishop takes knight, and Carlsen played rook to a8. And this game ended in a draw, which again should give us some confidence about the Jobava London system. But Carlsen, I think, later recommended this move, rook to a4, a little more aggressively placing that rook. And so this is probably decent for black. I wouldn't go here if I could avoid it. Simon Williams recommends, I think, probably the better move. The computers recommend this also, is the move a3, attempting to expand on the queen side with b4, with tempo hitting the queen. Now, in Simon Williams' program, he recommends this b6, or not recommends it, but covers it for black. And after b4 hitting the queen, queen to c6, knight to b5, again unveiling the bishop at f4 against the knight. Pawn takes, bishop takes knight. This is an equal but playable position for white. But Gawain Jones, covering the black pieces, does not recommend b6. He recommends a different move. Gawain Jones says black should play bishop to f5. That makes a lot of sense, clearing the back rank and immediately attacking the c2 pawn. So white responds with knight to d4, hitting the bishop at f5 and also defending the pawn at c2. The bishop goes to g4. After f3, the e3 pawn becomes a little bit of a weakness, not too much of one, but a little weakness. And bishop to d7. So now we have to ask the question, if we want to play this with white, what are we going to do with that knight on c7? Well, the move knight to b3 is the main move, and we're still in Gawain Jones' theory here. And after queen to c6, and black has to stay in contact with that d5 pawn, otherwise the knight would take it because the queen would defend the knight. So he has to continue to defend d5. the knight goes back to d4. So, black has two choices here. Black can play queen to c5. And in this case, if white wants to draw, he can go back to b3 and just go back and forth. However, if white wants to play for a win, he can play b4, he or she can play b4, queen to b6, b5, pushing forward, bishop takes, knight takes, knight takes, queen d4, offering the exchange of queens, and if queen to a5, knight takes b5, hitting the rook at a7, knight to c6, counterattacks the queen at d4, and after queen d3, rook a to a8, rook a to b1, putting the rook on the half-open file. I like this position for white. Now, computers give black a really, really small advantage here, far less than a pawn, like maybe 1/5 of a pawn. And the reason is, I think, because a white has two pawn weaknesses, one at a3 and c2. Nevertheless, I think I'd rather have white. All three minor pieces are well placed. You have the two bishop advantage, and the knight at b5 is in good shape. Something like rook f to d1, maybe play c4 to sort of liquidate the weakness and reduce a black central space. And despite what computers say, I think I'd rather have white in this position. That is if black plays the move queen to c5 after knight to d4. But Gawain Jones says black should play more aggressively. Black should play for the win with queen to b6. Well, what do we do then? Because his recommendation actually ends here. So how should white proceed in this position? Well, here's what I recommend. Queen to d2. Now, the pawn at b2 is poisoned. If black plays queen takes b2, then rook f to b1, and the queen is trapped. Knight to c6, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now the move a4, where white is threatening a5. If black, sort of unaware of the danger, plays rook f to c8 in order to take the knight and get two minor pieces for a rook, black is in huge trouble. After a5, if black plays queen to c5, then b4, the queen is trapped. If queen takes b2, the same, rook f to b1, and the queen is trapped again. So black really has to play a5. I love it when your opponent has to play must moves, and if they fail to do it, they lose. On move, 19? We like that. That's good stuff. And by playing a5, now that knight at c7 has the square at b5 that it can go to. c3, multi-purpose. It strengthens d4, limits the mobility of the g7 bishop a bit, and maybe white will expand on the queen's side later with b4. Rook to c8, queen to d4, offering the exchange of queens so that he doesn't have time to take that knight at c7. Knight f to d7. The bishop's attacking the queen. Queen takes b6, knight b6, knight b5, hitting the rook at a8. And after, say, rook f to d1, e6, you have an equal position, but with lots of play. There's still a lot to be played for here. White can maybe try to arrange c4 or e4. It'll be hard to arrange some of these things, but you can take your time to play this position. And this is a position where the best player will win. And you've made it, what, 24 moves in? And you're still playing a competitive game. Not only that, if white wants to force a draw here, white can with knight to c7, because the bishop and knight together keep hitting that rook. If the knight goes to a7, knight goes back to b5, hitting it. And if the knight goes here, boom, the knight goes back. And if black takes the knight with the bishop, now white would have the two bishop advantage. So the Jobava London system lives and is still, I think, very playable, particularly at club level and even, I think, at master level. I hope you've enjoyed this, and see you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.